questions? Yeah, I don't know why I sat down and didn't say, this is Professor Marion Maddox, Australia's foremost researcher, thinker in religion and politics. We're absolutely adoring honors to have her here. I kind of looked around and I just thought, you guys already know that. But thank you so much, that was fantastic. My experience with religion and politics, people either don't want to say anything and they're just, or there's lots to say. I'm looking at you guys like maybe there's a lot to say. So can I field questions?
Who do you include among the religious right?
Thanks, I should have set that out at the beginning. It's a kind of convenient catch-all term that's almost impossible to pin down. I don't think you can say that there are religious right people. I think you can say there are religious right issues and different people line up on different issues. So I think there are plenty of people who would be way to the right on abortion and way to the left on asylum seekers, for example. But also we know, and then there's the difference between official church statements and the practice of the faithful. So we know that the practice of, say, contraceptive use among Catholic couples is indistinguishable from the general population, even though the church maintains a very strict and unbending position. But there are, at the same time, particularly the parachurch organisations that I was talking about, so the Australian Christian Lobby, Centre for an Ethical Society, Salt Shakers, the Micah Challenge, those sort of groups, they tend to be much easier to divide up in left-right terms than either individual people or denominations. And the groups that have come out of the megachurches, such as that group of megachurches in Brisbane that have produced quite a number of lobby groups, are inclined to be much more consistently congregating towards concerns of the political right. So that constellation of free market solutions rather than redistributive solutions to poverty, conservative stances on sexuality, those other things that I listed. Yeah, so sorry for not making that clearer at the outset.
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to take up a couple of issues that are about the education of the chaplains. I'm a sociologist, but this isn't my area, but I am a member of the Anglican Synod of Newcastle. So I accept that the fact that dioceses like Newcastle have taken up the cause of low-fee private education as opposed to, just attending to the public system is a move to the right. But isn't that also a possibility that brings more students in contact with what you might call the Christian left rather than the Christian right? And the other thing is, I'm assuming you've got some evidence about what proportion of chaplains that have been appointed are evangelical as opposed to...
I do. In New South Wales is quite unusual in its pattern of appointment of school chaplains. In Queensland, well over 90% are appointed by Scripture Union, which has a fairly rigorous evangelical test for chaplains. And in Victoria, it's Access Ministries, which similarly has quite a rigorous evangelical test. New South Wales, the equivalent organisation is Generate, spelled G-E-N, capital R, letter number 8. But Generate is responsible for a much, much smaller proportion of the chaplains in schools, and schools have been much more autonomous in how they pick their chaplains. So there's actually, New South Wales is a more diverse exception to the pattern. South Australia has had school chaplains since before the introduction of the National School Chaplaincy Program, and they also tend to be more conservative than the evangelical and more homogeneous group. So yes, there is quite a bit of data around on that. I had a PhD student who's just submitted her thesis who's thesis is called What in Heaven's Name Are They Teaching Our Children, which is about religion in public schools, and she was able to gather quite a bit of information about that. Yes, there are low-fee independent Christian schools of the left, and they do bring students into contact with that point of view. But they're a much smaller group than the others, and my 4-year project is about religion in schools, and I have thought long and hard about this, and the conclusion I've come to is that schools are to educate people, and if we had a properly functioning, robust public school system, why do we need faith schools at all? I think that maybe we need them for minority faiths whose children are likely to be thoroughly alienated in a mainstream school, perhaps to give them a solid grounding with role models that they can look up to, but I don't understand why a robust, properly functioning public school system won't educate nearly all children properly.
Can I have a supplementary,
Yeah.
which is, as your PhD student or yourself consider the proposition that meeting a Scripture Union chaplain is likely to produce atheists?
Yes, that is known in the trade as the small dose inoculation principle, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence for it.
Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering whether or not one of the strategies which is going on with this, the magic mystery of why atheist politicians support these conservative moral positions is to do with political pragmatics, and that people practice one set of moral values for themselves, and then they quite like to see their politicians doing the opposite, or they like their bishops doing the opposite, and so that it's really a political choice that's going on rather than really trying to do something which all Australians would in fact go off and do.
I definitely think that is a big part of it, that the play is not to Christian right voters, of whom there are very few, but to a sort of moral mainstream who say, well, I don't need conservative values for myself, but I'd like other people to have them. I think they're good for politicians and good for children and good for welfare recipients and people who need more structure and direction in their life than I do. And so I suspect there's a constituency that votes for that. I would really like one day to find someone who's less frightened of numbers than I am to help me do some polling to try and discover that. Because I do think there's a reasonable amount of evidence to support that contention, but that doesn't tell us why it should be mainly not very religious politicians who bite that hook, and it's whatever you think of Rudd, I'm convinced that his religiosity was serious. I mean, he's the only Australian Prime Minister to have written a theological essay that I know of, and he tended to not do those sort of religious dog whistles, and it's people like Gillard who feel that they're on the back foot religiously who tend to go down those paths.
Yes, Kath.
Just following on from that, I was also thinking about the magical moments of this, and wondered if part of what's going on here is that there's a gap in relation to, obviously, elements of the religious right, and their articulators are like, they have a loud voice, but if there has been a lack of being able to articulate the more positive principles of secularism and humanism. I mean, for example, there is a very small group called the Secular Party, but they I mean, that doesn't hold much sway, but just that sort of public discourse on secularism and its productive aspects. And I wondered if you thought, since you're going to the atheism conference, you'd like to comment on the development of atheism, new atheism as a social movement, and what we might sort of witness, whether this voice is going to actually be some kind of counter to the religious right. For example, the census last year, where some of the atheist groups got together and funded the right, no religion in the census.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing about Australia particularly is that we don't actually have a strong secularist tradition, because we were founded after the heat had gone out of the Enlightenment debates about the Enlightenment critique of religion. And in Australia, religion has never seemed like the sort of thing that you would bother having a critique of. It's never seemed, serious enough a thing to bother having an argument about. And so consequently, we haven't had any of the kind of, we don't have the laissez-faire passion of France, or any of the, even the kind of wall of separation debates that get Americans hot under the collar. People who kind of look at each other and go, what? And therefore the atheism that has, insofar as we've had an atheist movement here, it's been a bit reactive. But I'd be very interested to attend the Global Atheist Convention, because a lot of the things that came out of the previous one were of that sort of reactive, look at all these people talking to their imaginary friend in the sky kind of atheism, of a sort of fairly unsophisticated kind. Whereas the panel that I'm going to be on is actually going to be quite funny, because after I outed myself, then another of the panellists, who's a member of the Greens Party, said that actually she wasn't an atheist either. She described herself as a collapsed Catholic. So if there's going to be a prize for the panel with the fewest actual atheists on it, then ours might be in for it. So and the organisers were very nice. They said, "Oh yes, we don't want to be. It's not going to be a Christian bashing session. We want to be broad-minded and inclusive." So it might signify a sort of, I hate to sound patronising, maturing in the atheist debate that they can talk to us. I'd be interested to see it anyway. And some of the things like the challenge to the National School Chaplaincy Program in the High Court, and the challenge that's just finished in the Fairness in Religion in Schools challenge to Access Ministries Christian Religious Education Instruction in Victoria, in the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. That has been quite kind of, I think, a bit opening, because it has brought out of the woodwork some Christian leaders who've said, well, actually we don't like this theology either. We think that there are other ways to have this conversation. And so it's seen a bit more of a sympathetic discussion between various kinds of secularists, some of them with religious views and some without, atheists, from atheists through to clergy, who all want to defend a particular inclusive version of secularism. So, so I think there might be a moment for a bit more of a defence of secularism as a productive, positive thing.
Yes, Terry.
Just, your comment about RUD, and I suppose, relative level of theological literacy to deal with the issues that are there, right, left, wherever, versus Julia, who has no literacy in that area, and so tends to get pulled around. I mean, I think you could translate a lot of that to international politics as well. The way in the Middle East, the extremes of, be it a Jewish right, a Palestinian right, sort of, captured politics captured the airwaves. It sort of gets wackier and wackier and wackier, less and less, controllable. It just seems to me we live in a world where, as educators, one of our biggest tasks is to provide some sort of religious and theological literacy that allows for dialogue to happen, or else we are inviting the wackies, whichever religion, to fill that space. And to me, that's what's kind of happening in Australia. There is a very low rate of theological literacy. It's something that we have not attended to. For 150 years, we've sort of tended to tell people you don't need that. Religion's dead, therefore theology must be dead. And we have created this vacuum, and it's being filled by the noisiest, the best organised, certainly not the most theologically sophisticated.
Well, I don't want to sound self-interested as a religious studies scholar, but I'm all for more religious literacy and more religious education. In fact, how many people knew that studies of religion was the 5th most popular elective subject in the New South Wales HSC in 2009, surpassing physics, chemistry, ancient history and modern history. But there is no pedagogically focused course that you can do in a public university in New South Wales to train to teach it. You can go to various evangelical colleges, Bible colleges. You can go to the Australian Catholic University, which is, of course, proper religious education. But you can't do a teacher training course in a public university in New South Wales, as far as I understand it, that will train you to be a teacher in studies of religion for year 11 and 12. And if you want to do studies in year 11 and 12, of course, there's nothing that you do through year 7, 8, 9 and 10 that prepares you for it. And Australia is alone among the world's most developed nations in not having a comparative religious education program through K-12. So that was one of the things that my student Kathy has been not only writing in her thesis but also presenting to the New South Wales Parliamentary Inquiry into ethics teaching, and you can read a summary of her submission on the ABC Religion and Ethics website if you're so inclined. I strongly recommend it.
Plus, it's hardly offered at universities.
Well, that's right. Yeah, and there's very little to tell you that you can that there's a follow-on between what you might study at school and what you might study at university.
Yes.
I'll just clarify what I'm hearing from you is saying that on your research you feel that Australia, I never said better off, but just if we had just a public school system without religious schools, that would be your opinion. But if there were, but if I also hear you saying if there were just state schools, you would like to see a good course in comparative religions. That's 2 points. If I got you correct on that.
Well, that is my opinion. Yeah, I know it's not everybody's opinion, but I mean, I don't make any claim about what should happen, but in terms of what governments should fund, I think there are some of the most successful education systems around the world. That's what they do, and I don't see why it wouldn't work for us.
So yeah, please, we'll do this as our last one.
I guess I just want to continue that point.
Yeah.
So I guess the implication then is you want a theologist teaching religion in schools.
No, I don't want a theologian, no. I think that religion in school should be taught by qualified teachers in the same way that history is taught by qualified teachers and maths is taught by qualified teachers.
Well, I'm just trying to, because a lot of emphasis placed on someone being maybe a practitioner or have have a desire or a love for the thing that they do when they teach. I'm just seeing a dislocation there between someone that's sort of taught how to teach something, someone that's practicing teaching something, a la an art teacher that doesn't do art, or a history teacher that doesn't sort of just learn history from all their books.
Well,
I just see a dislocation there.
depends what you think religion is, I guess, partly. When Penny Wong was interviewed, do you ever watch Kitchen Cabinet with Annabelle Crabb?
I missed that episode. I know it.
Because she was asked, Annabelle Crabb asked Penny Wong about why she went to church, and Penny Wong said, well, I think everybody's got a faith, whether they admit it or not. But mine happens to be that I belong to Pilgrim United Church. And I think you could say the same about, well, if you take that Penny Wong view, then whoever is going to be teaching religious studies has a faith. And all the students in the class have one too. And they're going to be taught to think not only critically but also appreciatively about their own and about those of all the other children in the class. Unlike in a scripture class now, where they're divided from one another and segregated on the basis of their different faiths. And it's the only time in the school week when students are segregated from one another and probably having, for many of them, their first ever experience with a release of being segregated, taken away from their friends and told you're different. And not learning together about one another, but learning just about their own tradition. So I think that there is definitely a place for being enculturated and faithed into your own tradition, but I don't know that in the classroom of the public school is that time or that place. But I don't see why any teacher can't teach with an enthusiasm and a love for all the traditions that are there in their class, and I've seen that happen and it happens in many classrooms around the world. So in European classrooms, it's a standard thing that study of religions is taught by the classroom teacher as part of the course curriculum, and of course they love the subject. They teach it with the engagement and love that an art teacher teaches or that a history teacher teaches. They choose to go to that subject because they love it and they love the children and they love teaching, and they teach with the same engagement and love that any teacher does. In New Zealand, my daughter went to a very multicultural school where the day started with what New Zealanders call karakia, which is the Maori word for the prayers that you do at the start of any important enterprise. And that was what we would probably call assembly or circle time. But every morning they would greet the children with a different greeting from a different language and of the chosen from among the languages of the children who were there, and with the appropriate gestures. So, namaste, and the children all knew to respond, namaste, this is so-and-so. Kia ora! And the children all knew to respond, kia ora! And it was fantastic, it was so beautiful. And it fully engaged the children because it was physical as well as verbal. And it also had a religious dimension from some of the greetings. And they sang also songs from the different traditions. And nobody could say that the children were not engaged or that the teachers were not engaged. So I think that the school scripture model that we've been used to, where the children are taken away and divided off, is one way of doing it. But it's far from the only, or far, I don't think it's the best way. I don't think it's the most appropriate way for preparing for children to live together in a multicultural and multi-faith society that we have now.
Well, with that, let's thank you again.